Okay. So let's discuss briefly what you guys talked about in breakout rooms. You had 3 points of inquiry. What is the cultural bomb? How the cultural bomb relates to code switching, and then to discuss your code switching homework that assignments you had over the weekend. Who wants to start us off? So who wants to discuss what was talked about in your breakout groups? Giovanni, what did you guys discuss in your breakout groups?
For the first question.
Any of them, whichever you prefer.
Okay, so for the I'm gonna answer the second one. So the how does culture bomb relate to code switching? So what I read was during the part it was during what is it, chapter one? I think it was when it starts off when it says how the author went to I think it was like an English where like scholars met in in Uganda, I think it was, but they were all English writers and speakers, but none of them were from what should I say? None of them wrote in African or spoke in African.
Right.
That's what I read, and I related that to code switching because like it's happening in Uganda, and which I mean, why shouldn't it be in the native language from there? I mean, why is it in English? Which could be something that he relates to, like I guess it's like before chapter one starts, how he says how they adapted like these Western, well, not techniques, how they adapted the Western. God, I can't think of words right now.
Yeah, the Western linguistic expression. So they wrote and thought in English, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Giovanni. That's absolutely a great way to correlate the cultural bomb to code switching, right? Who wants to provide a definition of the cultural bomb? So the first question in your breakout room, who could provide an example or a rough estimation of what they think the cultural bomb is?
I think that it kind of hits on like the cultural bomb being like like hesitation or restriction from like authors or writers or whatever it is with their language, where they're not really speaking the way that they would like to. They're speaking in a way that's pleasing to others, and then it kind of like leads down to like that one sentence on the third page where it says like the intended results are despair, despondency, and a collective death wish. It's kind of like the forgetting who they are.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Thank you, Jessica. Who wants to discuss their homework assignment over the week? The assignment was in spaces where you normally code switch, don't code switch, and see how that makes you feel, and see how others around you respond to your not code switching. I'm curious to hear how that went for you guys. Bianca, did you have a chance to do the assignment as far as not code switching?
I didn't really have a chance to do it because I don't know, like about the culture thing. I don't
So,
really know.
so you're saying you don't code switch often, or
No, I just act myself really, actually. I mean, only in like professional places. I don't know. I really just act myself.
okay?
Yeah.
So what if I'm understanding you correctly, you always are doing the assignment. You're always yourself, so you don't code switch, so you don't have to pretend not to code switch.
Yeah. Yeah.
I get a sense of that from you. I buy that. Maxwell, did you get a chance to do the assignment?
Yeah, sort of. I kind of was just like with my mom,
Okay.
and I tried to like speak regularly like I do on a daily basis, but it didn't feel right. I felt like I had to speak with a certain level of respect. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it would be kind of hard. Not necessarily say kind of hard, but yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with that, Maxwell. Like there's a level of respect that you have to exude with your parents, right? And that can only go so far. But I respect the attempt. Um, Ariel, did you have a chance to try to engage the non-code switching assignment?
Yeah, but I usually like always like speak like my other language, just say Spanish, and I always use both either way. Even in public, I really don't care what any other people think, so it doesn't really affect me as much.
Okay, good. I'm okay with that too. Ryan, how about you? Did you get a chance to do the code switching assignment?
Um, I guess because my cousin took me to his new apartment and stuff, and they have pool tables and stuff like that, and that's like one of my favorite games. And like, I gotta listen to music when I do anything, so I'm dancing and stuff like that because that's just me. That's what I do, and it's a lot of people, white people around, and they looking, but it's just I gotta be myself at all times. Like that's what I feel most comfortable, or I'm just gonna be sitting down, just in my own space. And I don't really like to be like that. I rather show people who I am than try to fake like I'm not that type of person. So
Yeah, again, I respect it, and I think for me, the goal is to get everyone at a space to where they're comfortable being their full self all the time, right? And that's why I had you guys engage with this social experiment, if you will, just to kind of push the borders and see how far you could take being yourself, right? But let's get into the reading. The book. This is the book. The book is entitled Decolonizing the Mind, The Politics of Language in African Literature. The author is Ngūgī wa Thiong'o. He's a professor of literature at University of California, Irvine, so he's not too far from us. He's another individual like Karanga who you could actually reach out to, and he will correspond back with you. So for me, one of the things that really stood out in the text, and it was in the what's it called, the statement. So before he gets to the introduction, he provides us with a statement. And in that statement, he says, "This book, Decolonizing the Mind, is my farewell to English as a vehicle for any of my writings. From now on, it is Kikuyu and Kiswahili all the way." Right? So to me, this is Ngūgī articulating, I will no longer code switch, right? I'm going to use my native language always when I produce my written text, right? So to me, I found that very profound. And then in the introduction, he says one of the issues that Africa faces, all of Africa's issues are always compartmentalized within these tribal differences. So if there's something going on in Uganda, it's a problem between tribe A and tribe B. If there's something going on in Morocco, it's a problem between tribe A and tribe B. What that does, and Ngūgī articulates, it effaces the role of colonialism. It causes focus not to be placed on how colonialism came in and created these tribes and created these tribal rifts. Okay, and then on page 3 of the introduction, he gives us his definition of the cultural bomb, and that's on the first full paragraph of page 3. I'll read the passage for you. He says, "The oppressed and the exploited of the earth maintain their defiance. Liberty from theft. But the biggest weapon wielded and actually daily unleashed by imperialism against that collective defiance is the cultural bomb. The effect of a cultural bomb is to annihilate a people's belief in their names, in their language, in their environment, in their heritage of struggle, in their unity, in their capacities, and ultimately in themselves." So that's what the cultural bomb does, right? It annihilates your ability to believe in your native culture, your native language, your native names, and he says even more so, yourself, right? So if we think about what Giovanni was saying as far as the Conference of African Writers of the English Expression, right? Here we are meeting in Africa, and these are strictly African writers who are meeting, but they can only meet because they write in the English language. So already they're showing a devalue for their language, right? That's an effect of the cultural bomb that Ngūgī is pointing to. And he also articulates like like Malidoma Patrice made last week, right? That the choice of language is central to a people's definition of themselves in relation to their natural and social environment, right? So how you relate to your natural environment, how you relate to your social environment is dictated and predicated by language, right? Just as Somé argued that your understanding of reality will be dictated by the language that you speak. So we talked about it a little bit, right? The Conference of African Writers of English Expression, and he says there was a contradiction at play within this conference. And then Ngūgī says he found it strange, ironic even, that him as a student with 2 short stories published in small publications was able to attend the conference, but his professor, who is probably the most world-renowned poet in Kenya, is not able to attend because he writes his poetry exclusively in his native language. So that's the problem, right? That's like the equivalent of Caesar being able to attend the conference because he writes in English, but me as your professor, although I have published books, right, I can't attend the conference because I write in Afrikan, right? So he's saying there's a contradiction at play here. And then he poses a question that I thought was profound and very generative for us as thinkers. And he says, how do we, as African writers, come to be so feeble towards the claims of our language on us and so aggressive in our claims on other languages, particularly the languages of our colonization? So if you kind of think back throughout the semester, I've always kind of articulated that there's 3 ways to pose and think about questions, right? 1, I don't understand this, so I have a question. 2, a question that will generate research. And then 3, a question for critique, right? I read that to you all because it is a great example of the last 2 ways of asking questions. A question to generate research. So Ngūgī can literally write a whole nother book about how do African writers become so feeble in defending their own language, right? So a question that produces more research. And then a question that produces critique. Because what he's doing also within this question is he's critiquing these African writers who so aggressively defend the English language, So again, I want you guys to start thinking about questions from the capacity of their ability to produce research and then their ability to produce a critique. So as we start to get towards the end of the semester and you're entering your journals, those are the type of questions I want to see you guys starting to ask. All right. And to close it out, I want to read this to you guys, and I'm curious to know what your thoughts on this is. He says, in my view, language was the most important vehicle through which that power fascinated and held the soul prisoner. The bullet was the means of physical subjugation. Language was the means of spiritual subjugation. So again, the bullet was the means of physical subjugation. Language was the means of spiritual subjugation. So 1, I think to really understand what he's trying to get at, I'll ask you guys, what does subjugation mean? Somebody provide me an example or a definition of subjugation.
The definition of it is the action of bringing someone or something under domination or control.
Yep. So to control or to dominate something, right? So if he says if he says the bullet was the means of physical subjugation and language is the means of spiritual subjugation, what does that mean?
From what I'm understanding is like, the bullet represents how to physically control people, while language is like spiritually control people,
Yep.
or like spiritually control yourself or something.
Yep, exactly. And not more so. Well, it could be both, Khalil, right? So it'll start off with controlling someone else, right? And then that control will get so sophisticated that they'll begin to control themselves. And if we think back to last week, and I mentioned the missions, right? So in fourth grade, we all had to do the missions. And I said that having indigenous people do that mission project is the equivalent of having African people build a plantation and go visit a plantation. Because when you spoke your native language in those missions, you were viciously beaten, right? And that subjugation that you felt became so advanced that you begin to police yourselves in not speaking your native language around the missions, right? So you're really onto something, Khalil, in the sense of not only does it cause you to be subjugated by another, but once that subjugation gets so sophisticated, you'll begin to subjugate your own self, ultimately subjugating and dominating and suppressing your spirit. So those are my notes for the reading. We'll transition into the fishbowl. Again, for your fishbowl, you have to go twice a semester. You have one time to pass. You could discuss what you talked about in your breakout rooms. You could discuss what was mentioned in my notes, or you could literally read from your journal. Does anybody want to volunteer for the fishbowl? All right, so I'll call that random. Jose, are you prepared to fishbowl today?
Not today.
Okay. So you used your one pass for the semester. Eric, are you prepared to fishbowl today? Eric, are you prepared to fishbowl today? Okay. Elizabeth, are you prepared to fishbowl today? Okay. Zachary, are you prepared to fishbowl today?
I think I'll pass. This wasn't my favorite reading,
Okay.
but I'll go next time. I'll go next time.
All right. Sean, are you prepared to fishbowl today?
Yeah. Like you said, the reading was a little more difficult, but yeah, I'll do what I can.
Okay. And again, there's no right or wrong way to do it. Amir, I got you. Let's get one more.
Can I go?
Who said that? I'm sorry. Jessica?
I did, Morelli.
Oh, Morelli. Okay, I got you. All right. So for today's fishbowl, we have Sean, Amir, and Morelli. For those will be the three to go. Whoever wants to set it off, it's on you.
I'll start it off. I want to go back a little bit to that language part that the professor touched on at the end, and how language is the key to culture, and the subjugation of language is kind of that's the end of your connection with that culture. And the assignment for the week was to go into the world, and in times you usually code switch, not code switch. And what I found was it was extremely hard for me to do. It was hard for me to do because usually I would code switch. Now I wouldn't do it on purpose. I would just do it of it being natural, the natural way I speak. And this is because the city where I come from, they had already taken that language that is so essential to culture and the way that the way that I speak around those that I love and those people that I'm familiar with. They had taken that away already. And when I went into the public settings, if I wanted to excel in the professional field or excel anywhere out of those communities that I was in, I would have to code switch. And I thought that was extremely powerful because in my city, they had taken the language that was just the way that I spoke, the way that me and the people of my culture and my community spoke, and they took that away in order for me to fit in. I found that very, very interesting because I could relate exactly what he's talking about in the book to how my life has gone today.
Amir, what city are you speaking of?
I grew up in Bakersfield. It's a small little agriculture town. It's about 2 hours away from here.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Bakersfield. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that.
I'd like to go ahead and build on what you said, Amir. I think we were talking about how taking away language destroys culture or can subjugate them in that way. And what the professor was saying earlier about how there's physical subjugation and then cultural subjugation. When I was reading that as well, what came to mind to me, because we read this in class, I thought about indigenous tribes, from here. And what you learn in class is the way they were subjugated was by force. And then after, they were sent to those reform schools and they make them stop talking their language. They change their clothes, they make them adapt to white culture. While I was doing the reading, I just kind of made that connection and was thinking about how they were physically subjugated, and then it went to the cultural aspect until they were either completely disconnected from their culture or just adapted to how the whites were.
It's a very good call out, Sean. Actually, I'm gonna let the next person go, and then I'm gonna piggyback on with something that Sean had mentioned.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out so I know it was focusing on the struggle of African countries under imperialism, but they did make the connection that the U.S. Struggle in Latin America as well as Asia and Polynesia.
Mm-hmm.
And like Jessica pointed out, it's a matter of imposing despair and despondency and a death wish on anyone who tries to liberate themselves, which I think is really interesting because I notice a lot of times as someone who has more quote unquote radical political views, I'm often told things like that the struggle against imperialism and oppressive politics is just absurd and kind of a utopian idea.
Mm-hmm.
But the reading points out that that's the whole point. The point is to keep people believing that there is no better alternative to the current system, which I thought was really interesting. And I think it could be connected to many other issues going on right now.
Yeah, thank you, Marley. Actually, you guys, this is a really good fishbowl. So thank you for everyone who participated. One thing that I did want to kind of touch on, and Sean mentioned it, is just for him, he said it made him think about how indigenous culture was subjugated. And, oftentimes, especially in this class, we frame, right, in dealing with language, English language as a colonial language, and then like the anti-colonial language is often framed as Spanish, especially for indigenous people from this country. But in reality, right, Spanish is just as much of a colonial language as English is, right? So why would I say that Spanish is just as much as a colonial language as English is? Why do you think I would say that?
Because of the Spanish conquerors that went to Mexico and they forced Spanish on the people.
Absolutely. Right. So to Sean's point, when he thinks about indigenous culture, right, those indigenous cultures weren't speaking Spanish, right? And the cultural bomb that those Spanish and European settlers set in the indigenous culture was so effective, I can't even think of an indigenous language. I don't even know one, right? I'll have to do some vast research to be able to come up with what that indigenous language is. And that's how effective that this cultural bomb has become, right? To the point now that you would code switch between two colonial languages, right? So I'm going to code switch away from my native, and I'm going to put air quotes around native colonial language and switch to the more accepted colonial language, right? So that's how effective this cultural bomb has been in eradicating indigenous culture, right? And not only indigenous culture, but it damn near eradicated indigenous people, right? That's how effective that cultural bomb was. And I completely agree with Marilee. She says that, to think about uprooting these imperial paradigms, right? You're positioned as something that's utopian or something that's beyond the scope of reason, right? But why is it? It should not be that something that we consider utopian, right? And when I think about utopian, I think about a society that puts humanity first. I think about a society that puts the group above the individual, right? Why is it that those things, we can't perceive a society operating under that? And when in reality, right, I would argue historically societies existed more utopian than not. I think we have more histories of utopian societies existing than this current iteration of society where everyone's individualistic and everyone's for themselves, right? I'm curious. Well, let me do this before I open it up fully to course conversation. So a lot of our dialogue has been around code switching, why people code switch, right? The activity was to get you not to code switch and see how that feels. But let's kind of approach this same conversation from a different angle. So what would happen if someone grew up in a society to where their language, their vernacular was authenticated, accepted, and validated, right? So I'm 37. I grew up in the 90s, right? And in the mid 90s, there was a very large conversation around Ebonics. And should Ebonics be recognized as a secondary language? And for those who speak Ebonics, should they be considered bilingual? So in Oakland, there was is anybody familiar with the Oakland area? Has anybody visited or have relatives in Oakland? So Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong, but they have a very distinctive accent or dialect in the Bay Area. Like you could have 100 black motherfuckers in the room and you would know that one person from Oakland by the way they talk. Okay. So and here is why, right? So in Oakland in the mid 90s, there was a study that was more of a social experiment taking place that they said the schools will recognize Ebonics as a secondary language, right? So the teachers would speak Ebonics, the students would be able to speak Ebonics, all of that was recognized, right? And I don't find it happenstance that a lot of people from Oakland who are around my age do not linguistically code switch. So if you think about sports, those familiar with Marshawn Lynch, you know there's no code switching in Marshawn Lynch. In the entertainment world, I think about Ryan Coogler. He's a producer from Oakland area as well. He did the Black Panther movie. He did the Creed movies. If you hear him in an interview, there's no code switching, right? So I think there's something to be said when your culture is validated, when your culture avoids that cultural bomb, you kind of come out unscathed and you don't feel that need to code switch. So what I want to do is show you guys a 5-minute video. It's an interview with Ryan Coogler. This allows you to kind of hear that accent that I'm speaking of, but it also, the conversation itself is very profound and it relates to our course topics. So give me 1 minute. Let me share my screen. Can y'all see the black screen? All right, bet.
One thing that was a central theme in the film was Black identity and this relationship between African Americans and Africans on the continent. Can you talk about what your relationship with the continent has been and, you know, what you see as the reconciliation between Africans and African Americans?
I mean, that's heavy, man. Like, I remember having a conversation about my own identity when I was very young, man. My parents had to sit me down and have a, you know, your black conversation. You know what I mean? And I think that it's a conversation that parents have to have in this country, and I think all over the world. You know, because it's a real thing. If you don't understand, not the fact that your skin looks like this, you know, but if you don't understand the fact that the world is going to treat you a certain way because of that, and you have to be ready for that. You know, it could cost you your life if your parents don't have that conversation with you. You know, and so I had that conversation at an early age, and what I found was, you know, I was a curious kid, and you know, so it's like, you know, you're African American, and I was big on why, like, what does that mean? You know what I mean? And so we come from the continent of Africa. We come from this place that you see on the map in school and that you see, you know, on the globe at home. You know, but I was in the Bay Area. I was as far away from the continent as you could be, you know, and still find black people. You know what I mean? Like, next thing you hit is Hawaii, I guess. You know what I mean? And, you know, I had a lot of pain inside of me due to not being able to, you know my ancestry and only being able to access that wound. And what we were taught, not to be long-winded, you know, but what we kind of taught about our own African American culture is that it's a bastardized culture. We taught that, we lost, the things that made us African. We don't have them anymore. You know what I mean? Like we had to make do with the scraps. And when I sat down with Marvel and said, hey, yo, for me to write this script, I need to go to the continent. I need to go like right now. They were like, man, go. And I went and started in South Africa because, it was really because Chadwick in Civil War and Dr. John Connie, they speak Xhosa, the dialect on the continent. And I went, I started there. I started there, and what I found was what I found as soon as I got there and I started, and I was by myself, and I was hanging out with cats that was working in a hotel, and they took me back to their township, and they were like, hey, let's go through the ritual. We're gonna go through the ritual. And I'm like, oh, ritual. So I'm expecting like painted face and I'm expecting to go all the way in, and what we pulled up at our house, and it was a bunch of young cats standing outside. You know what I'm saying? So I'm like, this feels familiar, And then, we go in and we walk to the house, and then all the OGs, I say from age like 50 to 70 was sitting in one section. I'm like, that's what happens at my house on weekends. So we keep going, and we go into the kitchen, and the women are in there cooking, and they talking, and they cooking all this food. And then you go out into the backyard, and there's some more young cats, like my age, and they had just slaughtered a cow and a goat, and they were cooking the food, and they were passing around this real cool African beer, and everybody was drinking from the same. It was like a exactly calabash. Everybody was drinking from that. They passing it back and forth, and I'm like, man, what ritual is this? And they was like, oh yeah, this I can't remember the name. We've been doing this for thousands of years. And I was like, well, we do this same ritual back at home, and then for them it was a no-brainer. They were like, yeah, of course you do, because y'all African, And I realized then, I was like, oh wow, yeah, right, because whatever this evil thing that happened to us, you know what I'm saying? Unfortunately, they don't teach us anything beyond that, But what they did to us, there was no way they could wipe out what we were for thousands of years. You know what I'm saying? And it was right. Something right there just made me completely whole. Like I was like, oh man, we've been African this whole time. When I stand outside, like when I hang with my family on the block in Oakland or Richmond, and all the youngsters stand outside, and my grandma's inside cooking. You know what I'm saying? And we being Africans, and even though we were told it was being hood, or it was being something else, we was being true to what we've been for thousands and thousands of years. So I felt connected, in a way that was very profound.
Give him a round of applause, please.
All right, so you kind of get an idea. One, if you listen to him, you see he's not trying to make himself sound professional, right? He's just speaking how he speaks. Low key, if you listen carefully, he almost said nigga like 3 times, just being himself, right? He had to kind of scale that back, right? But let me ask you, listening to him, did any of you get the impression that he was an inept movie producer, or he wasn't able to handle his professional duties? Did anybody get that sense from him, listening to him?
What I got from it was like, I felt good that he was able to be himself in that, in that space. That's just, you never see other, directors, sometimes Black directors don't even, talk like that, but he really keeps a sense of where he's from, and I think that's great.
And I also thought, well, maybe because who's interviewing him allowed that level of comfortability, right? But I went and checked other interviews, and it's consistent. No matter where he's at, he always presents himself in that fashion. So let's take it not so abstract, but let's bring it closer to home, right? I don't code switch. I speak to y'all how I speak on the block, how I speak to my family. I don't switch it up. So in your interactions with me throughout these, 3-4 weeks, have my unprofessionalism, does that enable, that's not the right word, does that prevent me from being able to be an effective professor for you, right? Has my inability to code switch been a hindrance from my ability to disseminate information to you all? Serious question, not rhetorical.
I'm bad to keep talking and stuff like that, but this is like the first class in my whole life where I'm like, I'm ready to go to class because I understand this dude, and it makes me, comfortable to be able to, pay attention and stuff like that. I got ADHD, so if I don't like what's going on, I'm thinking about other stuff. But this one, I'm zoned in and focused. So, man, it's like the best. God put me in the right position to be in this class because, man, I love it here.
Indeed. Khalil, I see your mic is off.
Yeah.
Go
One
ahead.
thing I do want to touch upon is like, yeah, you not code switching has not been a hindrance, but I can understand where it would be a hindrance because like when I lived in Hawaii for a bit, I went to school there. There's a dialect there called Pidgin, right? And that's like it's a form of slang.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not used to hearing it, like I wasn't at first, like moving there, you won't understand like 90% of the shit everybody says. Like even the teachers speak it.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm not saying like code switching is bad, but I do understand like in some cases in which like for me, especially like moving to Hawaii, it was a hard culture switch trying to just understand what was going on. But
and I think too that kind of operates, Khalil, as a language barrier, and so to speak,
Yeah.
right? But you're right. They could have. I'm sure they could have all spoke a standard vernacular English, and that had been more widely accepted and widely recognized. But I think really the point to take away is oftentimes we code switch because you feel that that's what's needed to do for you to be successful, for you to navigate a certain space. And I just want to show you that that is not always the case. You can very much be yourself and still be as successful as you want to be. In fact, I think you would be even more successful just because there's no conflict in between your true self and the professional persona that you have to take on to go to work. And Ryan, I would even go as far as to argue, you said I have ADHD, and I would say maybe not, right? Maybe you just haven't had an educational experience that speaks to you in a language that you can understand, right? So what happens is instead of them doing what's called culturally responsive teaching and meeting you at your level, they say, you have a learning disorder called ADHD that's causing you to be distracted. Nah, maybe you should correct your pedagogy to fit the student where they're at, right? So especially when it comes to young black males, students, like I do a lot of research on the educational experience of young black males, and we are the highest ones pegged with ADHD because the teachers refuse to speak their language, to respond to their cultural nuances, right? Even when I have a 5-year-old son who just started what they call TK, so it's not actual kindergarten, like a transitional kindergarten. And because I know how my son is, he's very intelligent. And what happens is he'll pick up some shit really quick. And if you're not continuing to feed him information, he's distracted. He's moved on. I learned that shit. I'm on to something else. And if you don't know that about him, you'll say that he's distracted, that he may have ADHD, right? So before I even let him go to school or before I even let that pick up, I'm already letting those teachers know, like, yo, this is how my son operates, right? And fortunately, I don't even know, like, just to see how your ancestors set his path, he has a black teacher. Like, even that kind of gave me a peace of mind because hopefully that cultural dissonance will not take place, right? So we have about 10 to 15 minutes left. I want to just hear what other people thought about either the assignment, thought about the reading, thought about anything that was discussed today in class. Open it up to class conversation.
What I thought was interesting was how the man who was interviewing him spoke and how he spoke. The man who was interviewing him seemed interesting. Now, I can't say if he's from Africa or anything, but he had his outfit on and stuff, and then he had spoke so proper to say that I was thrown off by it once he started speaking. I was expecting him to speak with some type of thick accent or a little bit of accent or a little bit more let's say, flavor in his voice, but he spoke very, very, very professional, kept it proper, and then you heard as it switched off to the director as the voices switch. I found that interesting.
Yo, that's a really good call out, man. Because I peeped that too, but I didn't put enough attention on it. But you're absolutely correct. And the brother is from Africa. He runs this website called OK Africa. It's a spinoff of this website called OK Player, which is like a hip hop website. But he focuses on like the African side of it. But you know, you're right. You're absolutely right. And again, I think that's attributed to Ryan Coogler coming from a space that says your Ebonics is okay, right? And no telling what that other brother went through coming up on the continent or migrating from the continent here to where his native language was not recognized. His accent that he may have had, he may have got clowned for that accent, so he had to massage that accent out so he could sound professional, right? So I think that's a really, really good point. Anybody else? Comments, questions, concerns, thoughts about what was covered today? Let's get 2 more comments from somebody we have not heard from today, and we'll call it a day.
Is it okay if I could talk about my experience for the switching, like the code switching?
Yeah.
So, like the others, how I forgot who said the same thing, but they said, well, I can't, there's no other way to communicate with my parents besides Spanish. They do know a bit of English, but I just talk to them mainly in Spanish, and I don't really have a problem with it. The only one weird experience was like someone just commented asking if it was Portuguese, but that was like a while back. But what it wasn't, I don't see myself as code switching, but what I did find was my brother, because he behaves a totally different way in the outs, like going out in public compared to like how he is at home, because usually at home he's messing around, like doing like, well, I don't know, like something about him, he hardly speaks Spanish. He does know how to speak it, but hardly speaks it, but he prefers to speak in English. But just something about him, just that, like, he does code switch, but I don't know what specifically, but he just doesn't seem like himself mostly.
And I think, Giovanni, like, think about it this way, right? And this is why I pose question 2. So when you look at your brother, is he switching from a space of he doesn't feel that the Spanish culture is valuable, right? Like, that's what the cultural bomb does, right? It makes you devalue your own native culture. And he's performing a role that he feels is more acceptable in the outside world, right? And I think, to me, if you can see that cultural bomb take effect in the way that your brother's performing, then you can say, that code switch is more aligned to that cultural bomb, right? And to me, there is a difference, right? Again, code switching is a survival mechanism. So you may have to do that just to kind of get through. But when it comes to your parents, right, that is a level of respect and authority that has to come into play that's different from your job, right? Your manager shouldn't have the same level of respect and authority as your parents do, right? So you shouldn't feel the need to dress yourself up more for your boss than you do your parents. To me, in my understanding of life, that would be out of context, right?
Yeah. I get you.
Yeah.
Okay. But like how you said, I think well, that's most likely what the thing is, because where I'm from, I live in Torrance, and there's a private, it's like, but the area specifically, it's like a mix of well, like for people from Latin America and a whole bunch of Asians, but the majority of the stores nearby I would have to say were like Asian stores. So that most likely is because like I do pay attention sometimes when I'm speaking to my mom, but like we do get like stared at sometimes for just speaking Spanish, because it seems like we don't belong, because like it's just a whole bunch of Asians in the store, and then like just one family of Mexicans. We stand out a bit.
Yeah, Torrance is interesting. It's an interesting area. Their demographic shift is the history of that is very interesting, because it started off largely black population, then it kind of migrated to shifted to more of a Asian demographic, and then the Hispanic demographic started to migrate in more recently. So yeah, you're right. It's a very interesting space down there in Torrance. Who else wants to share to close us out? Bianca, what were your thoughts on what was discussed and covered today?
I feel that like people should like not really care about what others think about their culture because that's part of them. And if there's people speaking a different language, then people shouldn't even look at you different. Like he was saying how like he feels off because there's a lot of Asians, they always stare at him. But if that's his language, then people should be accepting of it because everybody's different. So I just feel like everybody's different. They all have their own culture. So we should be accepting of it.
Yeah, I agree, and that goes back to this idea of relation, right? Like being able to respect the differences in people, and looking at those differences and how they could build new things, and that directly correlates to next week's reading. So let me pull up what our next week reading is. I'll show that to you guys, and we'll call it a day. We'll close out our conversation on relations with this reading here. Actually, who will be reading is Edward Glissant from Martinique. The book is titled Poetics of Relations, but the passage that we're reading is called The Open Boat. It's very short, but keep in mind this is a poetic. So don't take everything so literal. Think more figuratively, because essentially what a poetic is merging an essay and a poem and kind of putting those together to produce a poetic. So don't take everything so literal. You may have to read this a few times just to kind of get a better understanding of it. I will email you guys the readings tomorrow or Friday, but if you want to jump on that now, they're available to you on the Google Classroom site. Are there any final comments or questions or concerns